Welcome everyone. If you haven't already done so, can you just put your charity name or organisation name on your video screen so we can see who you are? And the majority, I think, are here who we're expecting. So I will start as it's 3 minutes past 12. Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us today at our second ever knowledge sharing event. These are member only events and they are there to provide a platform for members to share their knowledge with other members. And today's topic is how to be an effective influencer in Scotland. Today's event will be a little unusual in that we are delighted to have persuaded two speakers who are not part of the Neurological Alliance of Scotland, but who come armed with different perspectives, which we thought would be very useful given the topic we're discussing. The topic was chosen after one of our members asked the million-dollar question, how can a small organisation make a bigger impact? We thought this question resonated well, particularly as 12 of our members are small organisations, but also almost half of our members are UK charities with offices based in England. And as healthcare has devolved here, we thought it'd be useful to look at how Parliament and the Scottish Government works too. Our speakers today are Susan Brown, an Assistant Parliamentary Clerk in the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. Susan, can you raise your hand so we can all see you? There we go. Keith Park, who's Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager at MS Society Scotland. Keith, can you give us a wave? Thank you. And Richard Baker, who was a Labour MSP between 2003 and 2015, and who's recently joined the Enable Group as their Strategic Development Lead. Richard, could you raise your hand so we can all see you? There we go. Before I hand over to the panellists to introduce themselves, we'd like to run a couple of quick polls to get a taste for who's in the room and what you're hoping to get out of today's session. If you want to answer any of the questions, please go ahead and write in the chat box and Charlotte will keep an eye on that. So I'm just going to launch, there's 3 questions and keep me right here. So I think you'll see all 3 and then we'll get the answers. But Rona, perhaps you could just keep an eye and tell me what you can see from your point of view, because I have a different screen.
So that's come through to me. Hope it's come through to everyone else.
So is everyone able to take part in that poll? There we go. Just take a couple more minutes now to get everyone to answer. I think half of you have answered so far. Okay. You've got 10 more seconds to answer and then I'm going to close it. I think 3 or 4 people still to go, but we need to crack on. And I'm going to close that now. Here we go, and I'm going to share the results. So can everyone see? Yeah, so 50% of you say that influencing key stakeholders is a broad part of your role. The majority of you are here to find out how to influence the limited resources and then to get a better understanding of the political system in Scotland. And it looks like we've got a lot of experience here in the room, which is fantastic, with consultation responses and grassroots campaigning being the most commonly commonly used methods. So I'm going to stop sharing now and close that. That's great. Thank you very much for that. I hope that's been useful for our panelists to see who's in the room. over now to the panelists. We'll start with Susan, and I'll put my timer on. Susan, you have got 5 minutes to make your introduction.
It would help if I unmuted first. That's always a good step. So good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me along today. And it's lovely to see so many faces here. I can see some very well-known faces in the gallery, and some that I don't know as well. So that's great. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Susan Brown. I'm an assistant clerk to the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in Scottish Parliament. So I've been with the committee and its predecessor committee last session since August 2019. I've worked in health and social care for the last 15 years in both public sector and voluntary organisations, and I've worked in health and social care policy for almost a decade now as well. So immediately before joining Parliament, I worked in public affairs for Mary Carey, so some of you might know me from there. So we did a lot of lobbying and campaigning work as part of that, including, and I have to say it because Susan Webster is here from MND Scotland, including award-winning work to change the definition of terminal illness in social security legislation. So I worked with the brilliant Colette and Susan from MND Scotland. So just a little shout out. So what I should say is that in the committee office, I'm a little bit of an anomaly. It's unusual for clerks to have so much experience in one area. So in the Scottish Parliament, we're not civil servants, but the structure copies that system in a lot of ways. So that means that clerks can work in any committee or in the chamber. We get moved around a lot. We get moved around during a session, and almost all clerks start with a different committee at the beginning of every session. So I'm the exception in that I have stayed with the Health Committee for a second session, and that's predominantly because of my background in the area. So the purpose of Scottish Parliament committees is really to hold the Scottish Government to account. So we scrutinise policies, we scrutinise work, legislation, we ask questions of the government, and we try and challenge the status quo a bit. I came to Scottish Parliament because I'm really passionate about improving the lives of people in Scotland, and I really want to make a difference. To be honest, I also thought scrutiny could be better. I was sick of seeing amazing legislation on paper that doesn't actually translate to better systems for people and better lives for people on the ground. I was sick of the lack of joined up working, both within Scottish Government and within Scottish Parliament. I was sick of all the silos. I thought, and perhaps the good news is that after 3 years in Scottish Parliament, I still think that I can help change that. So that's good. In my time with the committee, I've helped them undertake post-legislative scrutiny, if I can say it. I've advised the committee on changes to primary legislation. I've designed inquiries to help challenge the committee in the way they think and do things. I'm currently coordinating an ambitious kind of cross-parliament, cross-committee, cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial and cross-government approach to one of the inquiries that we're doing. That's really trying to break down those silos across both government and parliament. I should say that working in a committee is demanding. We're a very small team. In our committee, we're a team of 4, but that actually works out to about 3 1/4 whole-time equivalent people, if that makes sense. And there's a lot that we do. We've got a weekly cycle of meetings that we have to keep on top of every week. It's a lot of admin to do around that. We write the committee's briefings and all the reports. We work on all the legislation that's referred to the committee. So one week we're looking at pensions, the next we're looking at sporting events, the next we're looking at social care residency charges. And through all of that, we're working with the MSPs weekly and we're advising them on the parliamentary rules as well as the law. What I should say is I've learned a lot from working in Scottish Parliament. Things that actually I wish I had known when I was on the other side, writing those consultation responses and liaising with MSPs. I know I would have done things differently had I known then what I know now. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of a steer from my experience on both sides of the cloth. Is that the expression? Anyway, I'll probably leave it there, end my intro just there, and then hopefully we can get into things a little bit more in questions. How do I do? Do I stick to time? I'm not sure.
You're amazing. You have 30 seconds left, so that was an exceptional start, and pressure is now on for Keith to manage within such great timekeeping as well. Thank you very much, Susan. That was really interesting, and I think you've fueled everyone with lots of ideas of things we want to ask about later on in the discussion. Keith, over to you.
Thanks, Alice. As Alice said earlier on, my name's Keith Park. I am the Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager at the MS Society in Scotland. I know a lot of faces that I can see on the screen today, and it's good to see so many of you here. And there's also some faces that I'm not so familiar with, so it's also good to see you've come along today. And I hope that you can learn something from me today, because to be honest, I was a little bit surprised to be asked to be on the panel today. So I'd like to thank Alice for giving me the opportunity, but also, as I say, for surprising me by asking me to come and share my experiences with you. I will definitely be listening very closely to Richard and Susan to see what I can pick up from their experience, because they're obviously coming at it from a very different perspective than myself. I'll start just to get a little bit of background as well. So I'm a physiotherapist training, going way back into the dark and distant past. And if you'd have asked the younger me, would I ever be in a job such as this when I'm trying to influence and change policy, I'd have probably laughed at you. Because at that age, I probably didn't see the comparisons and how what I was doing then could actually transfer across to what I'm doing now. And I think part of that's down to some of the words and some of the language we use around influencing and trying to change and engagement. It's not a mysterious process. Because if you look back to what I was doing as a physio, I was actually influencing people. It may have been done at a one-to-one level. So I was looking at identifying what the issue was. I was trying to undertake an analysis to figure out what caused that specific issue, do some problem solving to develop solutions around that, and come to an agreed objective in the way forward. And I think Susan put it very well in the quote that was on the Twitter feeds and stuff that we put out to promote the event. Having a tangible outcome is a key part to what we're trying to do when we're influencing, and having that underlying everything we do is really key to actually achieving the success. But I suppose the most important part that I learned as a physio that helped me today is around building relationships and developing that trust and getting others to see the benefits of what I was proposing, but also listening to them to see what it is that they wanted to get from that. So I may be coming at it very specifically that I want to get somebody up and moving, but what do they want to get from that? And having to listen to the other perspective and actually adapt and change my approach to actually acknowledge and respect that has been a key part to, and it's a key thing that I've done in terms of some of the work that we've been doing around adult disability payments, specifically in the 20-metre rule. So I may not agree with the government's position on that, but I can understand why they've come to that post. And just battering at the door, aggressively saying you're not right, I would never have achieved what we have achieved. And say I'll go into that in a little bit more detail once we actually have that conversation. So being able to see the other perspective and being able to counteract those arguments and those discussions and doing the preparation to be able to deal with that is quite an important thing. So I'd say I may have only been influencing one person at a time, or maybe the family as well, but those lessons really stood me in good stead in terms of where I've been. So I've been at the MS Society for a long time. I won't tell you exactly how long, just to let you guess where that goes. But in a variety of roles. So I started off in a sort of service development role, looking at the actual what services were being delivered. And again, it seemed like a logical step for me in terms of what I was wanting to try and do. And like Susan says, my key thing was I want to make a difference. I want to get involved in actually making things better for people. So my experience and skills of working within the NHS and to a lesser extent social care, I could utilise that experience to try and change the services that were being delivered at that time and use my knowledge and skills to do that. And then things just started to progress. So went from being service development work to looking at service improvement. So what is the big picture? So rather than working with the clinicians and practitioners who deliver the service, it was working and influencing with the management structures to try and change that from a different perspective. And most of that came at a local level, really. But then through time that progressed and I became more involved in some of the national work we're doing. And again, just as people have been saying, that involved consultation responses. But again, I think my personal experience of having the experience within the health service helped lead me down a specific route in terms of what we were doing health-wise. And that was probably still quite a lot of my function within the society. It was focusing on the health aspect of things because that's where my experience and my knowledge was. I've been in my existing post now for just over a year. I've taken over from Keith Robson, who many of you will know. And I have to be very nice to him because Richard's his friend, so I can't throw him under the bus at any point today. Who taught me a lot, I'll be very honest, taught me a lot and helped steer me and guide me and see again that quite a lot of what I was doing was transferable to other aspects of policy, and was able to do that and utilise my skills to help do that, which is great. So, as I say, influenced nationally, government, MSPs, Some of the work we would do is around looking at the Scottish Medicines Consortium in terms of which medicines are available for people living with MS. We've worked with the Health Technologies Group looking at different treatments that aren't a medicine based treatment, so and how we can influence within that. We've done some policy work around the remobilisation of the NHS, and again, some of you have been at the policy group meetings to hear about that and where we want to steer with that. So I'm going to try and use those experiences just to highlight some of the issues and some of the work that we've done and share my experience with you. I'm not saying it's always been right, say there's ways and mistakes that we've made, and hopefully we can share and discuss those as well, but I can share my experience with you and hopefully you'll learn something today. And as I say, I'll very much be taking notes from Susan and Richard. But there's two things that I just want to finish off with. From our perspective, the biggest tool we have, and I don't like using the word tool and toolkits, it just doesn't fit right, but the biggest strength we have in terms of doing our influencing work is the MS community. They have the experience, they have the knowledge of what the impacts of the policies are to them. So being able to use those experiences to play the emotive angle, and it helps gain understanding from MSPs if you can play that emotive angle, but also they give us the evidence base in terms of what the actual real, not the real life impact, but what the evidence is in terms of the impact that has. And being able to strike those balances is key. And it's a long drawn out process quite often, just to finish off with, just like my introduction.
Thank you very much, Keith. Yeah, I saw I let you run over a little bit there, but that was very interesting. Thank you very much for your introduction. And moving swiftly on, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Richard Baker.
Thank you very much, Alison. Hopefully you can all hear me all right. I'm in a public area because I've had to pop out a meeting, so apologies for any noises off. But thank you so much for inviting me to contribute today. It's great to be able to speak to the group. And as I was saying, my name is Richard Baker. Until recently, I was the head of policy, public affairs and research at Sight Scotland and Sight Scotland Veterans. But for all of 2 weeks now, I've been the strategic development leader at Enable Scotland. Enable's got this great phrase, which is to campaign on the solution. Enable's My Own Front Door campaign is a great example of this. It highlights both the issue of many disabled people who are still not in appropriate care settings, but also it brings forward solutions to the problem too. And the director of Enable Scotland, Jan Savage, can speak to you all about that great campaign, My Own Front Door. But I've been asked to speak to you just for 5 minutes, obviously, about my own involvement in policy campaigns. And rather than bore you with PowerPoint slides, just to use a few pictures, talk about some of my own experiences over a very, very long time of involvement in policy and public affairs in Scotland. And given my previous role campaigning on sight loss issues, I'll be sure to describe each of the pictures as well. So I'm hoping that the technology gods are with us today, and not being famed for my own technological capabilities, I'm going to attempt to show show you the pictures which I've put together for today, and hopefully you can see those all right. And on that basis, I will just go through what these pictures are. And the first picture you will see is of me with Jim Wallace, and that he was the leader of Scottish Liberal Democrats then, and I was president of National Union of Students in Scotland. And it's black and white picture because it's just so long ago, and that was during the tuition fees campaign back in the very first Parliament. And I wanted to show that picture because, you know, we did a huge range of things in that campaign. We researched student funding issues with big marches, big demonstrations. But the key thing was we knew we had the votes in Parliament if everyone stuck to the manifestos. So in that picture, I'm coercing Jim to sign a pledge to scrap tuition fees. And it was very much a parliamentary campaign, parliamentary tactics based on debates in Parliament, persuading MSPs directly, and it worked because we knew we had the votes. Now, beneath that picture, you may be wondering why it's not a very clear picture, but it's a picture of some older people in a skip. Now, you'll wonder why they are in a skip, but I'll come back to this. I will explain why in a moment or two. But my next job was at Help the Aged Scotland, and I arrived in that job just as we had the debates again in Parliament around free personal care for older people. And again, you know, it was an interesting dynamic at the time with a coalition government of Labour, Liberal and Liberal Democrats. There was some disagreements on a number of different policy areas. And again, we were able to, through parliamentary tactics, lever that situation. It was a time we really could win votes in Parliament and change the view of government because of the numbers in Parliament. And we did that on free personal care as well. And we changed the policies the Scottish Government, and still does now, provides free personal care for older people. But that's not always going to work. Sometimes just contacting MSPs directly, you have to do more than that. And you've got to have campaigns in the general public as well. And that is where the picture of older people in a skip comes in, because that campaign, when I was at Help the Aged, was based on tackling the problem of older people not being able to get jobs, age discrimination in the workplace. And so the campaign there was, don't put older people on the scrap heap. And that image, that picture, which we put together for the media, was really effective in describing very quickly and engagingly that policy campaign. And we secured both coverage, both at a UK level and a Scottish level for that campaign. So often it will be the case that you're going to have to campaign, not just in Parliament, not just decision makers, but building that body of opinion, which general public, which will in turn influence how MSPs vote, decisions ministers will make. And that can be a tough job, but can it? For many of us, for many smaller charities, smaller issues, for those of us working on health policy campaigns, it's a really cluttered area. I mean, there's so many competing priorities for health services and for healthcare, for health policy. So, and that was certainly the case for me in sight loss and visual impairment when I was at Sight Scotland. And so one of the ways we sought to address that issue was to do collaborations with other charities to try and combine our resources and our campaign impact. And so the next picture is of the report we produced, Emotional Support for Sight Loss. And we worked with the Mental Health Foundation, drawing on their expertise on mental health issues and speaking to over 400 people with visual impairment about how sight loss had affected their mental health. And through that, producing that research, getting again national coverage for it as well, and really influencing government policy around how eye health services support people with the emotional impact of losing their sight. But also crucial, it's crucial to have powerful advocates from the people these campaigns directly affect themselves. That term I'm not very comfortable with, the people with lived experience, these are all the time, but what it means is having advocates to campaigns for whom these campaigns will make a difference in their lives. And on the picture front of that report is Kieran Saeed, who is a fantastic campaigner on visual impairment issues, and no one could be more, better talking about our own experiences, but making a case for change as well. And the final, I know my time's up, I'm typical ex-politician going over, the final picture there is of Gordon Aitman. And I wanted to speak briefly about Gordon as well, because I think Gordon encapsulates what a great campaigner is. Gordon spoke passionately from his own experience. I'm sure you'll all be aware of Gordon's Fight Back campaign about motor neurone disease. Tragically, Gordon died when he was only 32, but before then he did so much. And he's a friend of mine. He worked in my office and led my campaigns and policy work in Parliament. And I knew already what a great campaigner he was. Gordon was about half the freedom of information requests in Scotland at one point. He was fantastic at analysing data and evidence and making a strong case for policy change. And that's why Gordon didn't only have such an impact raising huge amounts of funds for MND services and for new research through to speaking about his own personal experience, but doing so well engaging with the media, engaging with politicians, getting a high profile campaign to achieve so much. And so I think it's about everything, about how you use all the different tactics you can to have an impact. And Gordon and his work around MNT is a brilliant example, I think, for us all reflecting about how we can have the best possible success in our own policy campaigns.
Thank you very much, Richard. Are you able to stop sharing that screen so we can go back to the gallery view? Thank you very much. Yes, so I think you're all responding very well to me kind of waving at you when you're going over. I'm reluctant to sort of interrupt you with my voice. So I think that's, if you're happy to keep an eye on me waving, then we'll stick to that tactic. So we're just going to move on to the next part of our agenda. So thank you very much for your intros. The next part is going to be some preset questions that came in from our members over the last couple of weeks, which I have given to the panelists. And in order to go through them properly and give them the time that they need, we're going to just stick to one panelist per question, but with the option of the other panelists chipping in if they want to. So kicking off, we're going to have question 1, which is directed to Keith. And the question, which Charlotte, I don't know if you can cut and paste these into the chat box as I put them through, but the first question is, Parliament has many functions and charities use a variety of these functions to influence policy, including parliamentary questions, motions, members' debates and petitions. Which function do you think works best and why?
Thanks, Alice. I think I'm going to pick up on what Richard said just to start off with, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this to say that one specific option is the best option. I think it has to be a combination of different options to get across what you're trying to achieve. So I think the starting point, again, and I'll come back to what Susan had said in our pre-submitted quote, it's about what you're trying to get and what's your objective. So starting with your objective and what you're trying to achieve, work back to figure out what it is that you want to do and how you want to achieve that, and then analyse which options are best for you. I think in an ideal world, we try and use a combination of them all to try and put different pressure on different aspects of the system, again, just as Richard was saying around Gordon Aikman. So I think there's analysis where you as an organisation as well, what evidence do you have already, what evidence do you have already gathered from your own experience and from what other organisations have produced out there, what Scottish Government have necessarily produced that's out there. What relationships do you already have? What MSPs do you have a relationship with as an organisation as well? Who has a specific interest in the work that you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve? Because there will be MSPs out there who may share a specific issue with you. And what evidence do you have in terms of what the government's position is? Now, some of this you might know naturally, some of it you might have to do that a little bit more digging. And then I think having that background and doing that preparation work is key to being able to decide which options to use to best take your question forward. I'll speak a little bit about each of them and how we as an organisation have used them, but also some examples that I know that have worked quite well for others. So the one that I'll start off with is just talking about a members' debate. And again, I think Richard mentioned that as one of the options around Gordon Aikman's position and some of the other examples that you've given. But the example that strikes best for me is a campaign that was started in Murray, so up in Elgin. A family, unfortunately, the father of the family died in a boating accident. It was a really cheery story to start you all off with. I apologise for that. But what came out of that was the fact that the mortuary that was in Elgin wasn't fit for purpose. So it was an old, decrepit hospital. There wasn't a family waiting area. There wasn't something that was there. So the family were rightly horrified by this. And they wanted to try and make a change, initially specifically in Elgin. So they got their local MSP, who was Richard Lockhead, involved, who organised a members' debate on the issue. And what happened was this is mirrored across big parts of Scotland, the fact that there was issues with in terms of the actual mortuary provision, and it wasn't fit for purpose to support families going through what is a pretty horrific time. Because it wasn't a specific party political policy as such, it was much easier to gain traction with this as across the board, because everybody could relate to the emotive side of it rather than having that party specific position on it. So that members' debate led to change both in Elgin but across Scotland. So it was something that was actually very well used by the family to actually achieve that goal. But in some other issues, if it was a party political thing and it's a government policy again, I'm not sure how valid it would be to have that members' debate to try and take that argument across, and there might be other ways to actually bring that debate and conversation around. We've used debates at the MS Society, and we've probably railroaded one of them slightly, which was around the benefits maximisation debate that the Scottish Government brought forward towards the end of last year. And we provided a briefing to the MSPs from each party, each opposition party, who were on the Social Security Committee, but also others that we knew had an interest in the specific aspects of it. And we very much highlighted the campaign work that we were doing around adult disability payment, the 20-metre rule. And every single MSP, opposition MSP, apart from one, mentioned the MS Society and mentioned the 20-metre rule. And the focus of the debate was very much twisted and turned towards that. So again, it was taking that opportunity of highlighting something and using that opportunity to be able to highlight something that we wanted to get across. So it might not have been directly related to that debate, but it was something that we could actually tenuously link in, but we had the support from MSPs to be able to do that. And it was something that was very much focused in on. I know, again, I've spoken to quite a few people in the part of the policy group around our petition again, which is around ADP. And I know that's Mary from the Scottish Tremor Society has a petition out as well, and I say it's a very good way of actually having the chance to raise an issue, show the public support for that specific issue. I'm not sure all petitions are as effective way of taking that message forward, but we had a very specific goal set aside for ours, which was to keep the debate live after the consultation closed around adult disability payment, but also to try and get an opportunity to actually go and speak to MSPs and in committee and try and use the weight of the committee evidence to then influence the government afterwards. The committee ran with it quite well and actually engaged with Scottish Government, engaged with DWP and gathered more evidence that we could then use as part of our campaign going forward. So it was a different way to get some of that information and that evidence that we needed, but without necessarily being the best way to do that. In terms of, I'll just finish quickly, Alice, if that's okay. Parliamentary questions are a great tool for gathering evidence from Scottish Government if you don't have that evidence already, but also getting the Scottish Government on record to say something. And parliamentary motions is probably something that we don't use hugely except to promote reports that were published, but it's a good way of highlighting and getting an idea of which other MSPs may be in support of your position and being able to then target them to follow up with. And I think I've covered it all there.
Amazing, thank you very much. That was like a I don't know, like a lesson, a very quick lesson in the parliamentary system and how to use it. So thank you so much, that was very clear. I can see in the chat box that Mary's asked a question specifically to Susan on this. So Susan, I don't know if you can see the chat box. Can you? Yeah, you can. Would you be happy to consider how or why Parliament doesn't listen to people? This is from Mary's perspective, who have conditions, and this is something, I don't know, Mary, if you want to come in and ask a question to expand on that. I can't, there you are.
Yes, I have been trying to get the Parliament to speak to myself and Ian Sharp, who is the first person in Scotland to have focused ultrasound treatment. I was the first person in Scotland to have deep brain stimulation almost 18 years ago. And the Scottish Government will not speak to the two of us. And I think for all conditions, it would be beneficial if they spoke to people that have experience of living with these conditions. Because unless you have, like in my case, essential tremor, you cannot possibly understand basically the torture that you go through life living, unless you speak to someone who has that experience. I don't know if there's anything you can suggest, Susan.
So first of all, sorry to hear about your experiences. I can't speak for Scottish Government, obviously, I'm in Parliament, but I do know that things are changing in Parliament. I know they haven't done a great deal of engagement work before, but engagement work has been going on with people, and again, like Richard, I hate to use the word with lived experience, but there have been recent changes in the last few years, particularly within the committee office where I'm based. We now have a dedicated participation and communities team who are responsible for going out and speaking to people and bringing that experience into the committee. So we've actually, in the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, we've done a range of events speaking directly to people who do have that lived experience about the issues that we're kind of that we're dealing with in the committee. So I've kind of, over the last couple of years, I've spoken as part of legislative work, I've spoken to women who have had transvaginal mesh implants with this piece of legislation. We did that on that just before Christmas. I'm also doing inquiry at the moment on health inequalities, and we're talking to a range of stakeholders, people with lived experience supported by organisations. So I guess I don't have a direct answer for you, but I know that things are changing and the Parliament is looking at how it can be more inclusive and how it can speak to people. The Petitions Committee in particular, which the process that you're going through, I know the petitions committee also do that kind of community engagement as well on issues. I know that petitions, once they've come to the end of their kind of lifespan in the petitions committee, they then can often be referred to subject committees as well. So it might be that if the petitions committee can then do no more for you, then it might be referred on to one of the subject committees like the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but hopefully it does kind of
We're
set your
planning,
fears aside a bit, that we are kind of listening to people.
we're planning having a, what they call a drop-in day at the Parliament, the end of April, beginning of May, for MSPs if they'd like to find out more about the condition and what the focus ultrasound will help. Now,
Mary, I'm so sorry to interrupt you here, but
Okay.
I think we'll take this one onto the side because I've got
Yeah.
6 more big questions to do, but I'll hook you and Susan up afterwards.
okay.
And I'm sorry for that interruption.
No, that's okay, Alice.
Well, Keith and Susan, thank you very much for covering question 1. Question 2, Susan, this is for you. Charlotte, again, I don't know if you could put this one into the chat box. And it is, how can charities be most influential in a consultation response?
Just going to go back ever so briefly into question 1, because I agreed with a lot of what Keith was saying there. I just wanted to say, so it's often not formal tools in Parliament that will make the biggest difference. So it's often a combination of those tools, as Keith was highlighting, but actually, and I hate to kind of phrase it like this, but it's kind of who you know. And I don't mean that as in kind of like, oh, we don't know who you are. And I mean that you have to have relationships with MSPs to influence them. And Richard spoke about this, and Keith already spoke about this as well, but it's really key. And this probably isn't kind of what people want to hear, especially if it's not their main part of their job. You do need to work on those relationships, and it is a full-time job. You do need to kind of maintain those relationships with politicians. So then when you do have an ask for them, you know who you can go to, you can speak to them directly. And then that's often a lot more persuasive than just the formal tools. So just an emotion or a petition, it's speaking to people, it's relationships. That's quite a lot of the job. Anyway, I will go on to question 2, so sorry about that. How can you be most influential in a consultation response? So I have a lot of experience of writing consultation responses and also now receiving them. So I've got lots of hints and tips from both sides of the coin there. Firstly, I would say, if you're writing consultation response, answer the questions that they've set. And now I say this because I never did. Whenever I wrote consultation responses, I was like, that's not the important issue. I know what the important issue is. I'll tell you what the important issue is. And I would ignore the questions and I would write what the important issue was for our organisation, which is exactly what I should have been doing for our organisation. But now from the other side of it, that's really not what the committee wants. We can't look at everything in an inquiry, everything on a subject. There's certain areas that the members of the committee are interested in looking at, and that consultation tells you what that is. So you could absolutely say if there are other important areas to focus on, but you definitely want to be answering the questions that they're asking. That's really big. Otherwise, you're not going to be, given the high profile that you want. And just to tell you a little bit about what happens once you submit a consultation response. So it is analysed in the background by our SPICE researchers. So that's the Scottish Parliament Information. Oh God, I can't remember the acronym. SPICE anyway. So they will analyse those responses and they put together briefings for members. So this might come as a shock to you, but the members of the committees will not. Centre, thank you, Tana. Brilliant. Members will not read every single response that they get. It is analysed and it is put into a briefing form. So you kind of want to make sure that your issues are included in that briefing. If you're not answering the questions, that's what that briefing will be centred on. So you might have a brilliant point that might make it in, but you might not be seen if you're not answering the questions that they ask. So I should also say, keep it short. we once had a 34-page response in the committee, which doesn't seem like a great deal, but inquiries, you can get thousands of responses, and it's usually 1 or 2 people that have to read all of those responses. So if you had 34 pages responses, then that's like 34,000 pages that you have to read. And somebody does read it all. I read all of them on that come into health and sport, health, social care and sport, because we have to look at them through monitoring and to obviously get an idea of the issues. But it's Spice who will read them all and go through and do all of the analysis. So one of my tips is keep it short, keep it to the main points. If you are selected to give evidence in committee, then you can go into it a bit more. I'm not saying do a page, you know, up to kind of 10 pages is acceptable, but 34 pages is a little bit of a step too far. Another thing that I would say is, and this is all very system-y process at the moment, but don't be late and don't ask for an extension unless you really need it. And I say that because the turnaround time that committees have for analysing those responses and for selecting witnesses for evidence in committee is very short. If you're late, you run the risk of not being included in either of those. So now we do actually go back and tell people if they want an extension, they might not be included in the consideration for the analysis and the witness selection. And then what's the point? Because it primarily won't be seen and won't be used. So that's just a little tip. I mean, a couple of days is usually fine, but any later than that, then you're kind of cutting your nose off to spite your face a little bit there. Other things I should say is that you know, you want to really think about the wider situation, not just your own policy area. And this was the trap that I fell into every single time. I would focus on just my one policy area. But now looking from the other side of things, actually, it's the bigger issues that they're looking at. They're not looking at single policy issues. They're looking at the wider systemic issues. And it's how your evidence can feed into those wider systemic issues. That's what they're interested in. That's what we're interested in. That's what the majority of committees will be looking at. And it's usually the witnesses that are selected to give formal evidence in committee sessions that have done that have given a wider perspective, but shown how their issue entwines into the bigger issue. So in saying that as well, the more collaboration you can have with other organizations, the better. If you can write a joint response, that's great. Or if there is a bit of a response that you particularly agree with, see it again. Don't just say that you agree with their response, actually put it in your own response, because the more that an issue is mentioned, the more will be included in that analysis and that members see. Now, they will get a link to all of the written submissions, but again, if there's 1,000 submissions, they're not going to read, they'll read the briefing. There's a couple of other things. I've just had a wave, but I will just mention one more. The way that the Scottish Parliament gets views is through Citizen Space, which is an online platform. If you can, I would suggest submitting it through that platform, because that has a back to it, a back end to the process, and all the analysis is undertaken on that software. So if you're submitting by a Word document, PDF, something like that that comes in the committee, it's then harder to be included in the analysis. There's a few tips on systems and ways of doing things, but I should say if you do want to influence what committees are looking at in an inquiry, you need to do it before. You need to do it much further in advance when they're setting their work programs. So you're looking to be liaising with them in May or June time, find out what they're going to be setting for the next year. If you're wanting to shape what an inquiry would look like or suggest topics. By the time it gets to consultation, the committee already know what they're doing and they already know what areas they want to be focusing on. And I'll leave it there. Sorry for overrunning hours.
I think that question deserves a bit more time, to be honest. I think consultation responses are something that we're all aware of, we've all contributed to, and actually I can see a few hands in the air. So Tanith, I'll start with you. Is that a legacy hand or is that a question?
No, it's a question. Susan, thank you so much. I think you've really given us a great insight into how to respond to Scottish Parliament consultations. However, Scottish Government consultations are a whole different matter. And what I'm really interested in is your thing about answer the questions, because one of the things about Scottish Government consultations, which is increasingly problematic for me, is very closed questions, which are clearly designed, as in the recent National Care Service consultation, to act as a plebiscite for how brilliant whatever policy the government is aiming to introduce is. So they will say, do you think it's a good idea to do this? And if you say yes or no, well, you know, it's designed to make you say yes, and then you get a press release that says, everybody thinks the National Care Service is brilliant. Actually, most organisations had at best a nuanced position on the National Care Service and didn't wholeheartedly support it at all, but that absolutely wasn't the way it was spun. I do think that there is a real issue of democracy and scrutiny there, actually, about the way that government is working. But I'm sure that if you asked an official of Scottish Government, they too would say, answer the question. The way that I've got around this from a Parkinson's UK point of view is to refuse to tick the agree disagree box and just put my text in. But I do think that I think that we can depend on the Parliament not to be playing party political games with consultations that you're doing, not least because the clerks are acting as a check or balance. I think with petitions issued by, or consultations issued by Scottish Government, it is a different ball game. And as people responding to those consultations, we have to be also considering the use to which ticks in boxes may be put. And I don't know whether other panelists have a view on that, because I think it's an important consideration if you're applying to a consultation that's come from Scottish Government wanting to pursue a specific policy agenda, which is not the same thing as the Parliament's doing when it consults.
That's a really, really essential point by Tanith, actually. So Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government are different. The way that you reply to your consultations are different for both of them. You cannot do the same response in both. Different functions, different purposes. But Tom's really right, and there is a lot of yes, no questions, and they are designed to spin support for something. How to get around that? It's really bad survey design to start with, and it's not something that we would do in Scottish Parliament. How to get around that? I think you're doing exactly what you should be doing there, writing your responses in the text that's provided for. I think I would probably be reticent, and I think in the past when I have been doing consultations, I again have not been showing support or not showing support for things. I've been leaving those check boxes blank as well, because as you say, things are a lot more nuanced. I'm not sure how we get around that, Scottish Government, to be honest with you. Richard or Keith, I don't know if you have any wisdom to add there.
I think that's a really good point that Tanith made around, and you made also about just put in your text, don't tick the box. I mean, I also think it's often an opportunity sometimes just to send in your statement, isn't there, rather than to fill in you know, just the pro forma template which the Scottish Government's put together. And I suppose if one was to be slightly cynical, perhaps we're being slightly cynical here, Tanith, is that, you know, you do worry, don't you, that they're looking to get certain responses, certain data from it. I obviously it's our job as a sector to make sure that we get across the views of the people who we work with and their priorities. And it's not easy, as you were saying, Susan, but I just think we have to try and find the best approach we can with the opportunity to consult which we're given.
I was just going to say, I agree completely with what Tanith has said, and we've had that same conversation around the frustrations, the way the consultations are designed. I think there's been times when we've probably said no to questions because we slightly disagree, because that way at least you're not being said that you agree, and actually has more of an opportunity to come out in the statistics that way. But very much it's either what answer generally has a huge caveat in terms of how much you and what you actually explain in terms of the free text box. But yeah, it's a complete frustration of ours as well. So completely agree, Tana.
Thank you very much, everyone. Sue, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to clear up a question that I didn't quite understand, or rather I didn't understand the answer. So is it better that we collaborate and submit one response, or so that we're many in the Scottish Neurological Alliance, or should we be collaborating, submitting the one response, and then all doing our own individual responses as well, because that increases the numbers?
No, so it's an either or, I would say. You would either do one collectively, or you would do one on your own, but you would say that you agree with, say, if Tanit had written something on one aspect, you would say that we agree with that, but then you would highlight what that actual issue is as well. But if you do both, then that doesn't count as kind of, you know, two. It's only if you have something different to say in your individual one that you'll be doing. If that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Just mindful of the time, I'm going to move on to question 3. If people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and Charlotte is keeping an eye on that, so we can feed them in, or we can try and get answers to you afterwards. Richard, this one's for you. And again, Charlotte, can you tap it into the chat box? And the question is, if an initial approach has been brushed off or ignored by the recipient, what is the most effective way to escalate a matter?
Well, clearly there are 4 mechanisms to do so. If someone's really irritated you or treated you badly, you can go to the Standards Commissioner, the presiding officer, or the party whips, but you're really in danger of irritating and alienating people at that point. And so, you know, I think if you think very carefully about whether you want to escalate something to that level, I think there are many other ways to try and make sure that you are listened to, and an MSP, a minister, does pay attention to you. So if it's a minister you don't get reply from, and often they're very, very busy schedules and diaries, and I would just frankly keep pestering the private office until someone gives me a response, and usually you have to be quite persistent about that. If it's an MSP and it's a particular issue, if it's a policy issue in Parliament, find somebody else in the relevant committee, speak to them, you know, and just try and pursue your query that way. If it's a local or regional issue, constituency issue, well, one of the beauties of the not a perfect system, I would say, for the Scottish Parliament in terms of our electoral system, but you do have 7 regional MSPs as well as your constituency member as regional member. I mean, I do understand people often want to get a constituency member on board, but they've got a heavy caseload sometimes as well. And so if you go to regional member and they start taking the issue up, then quite often you find after that the constituency member gets involved as well. So there, you know, there's a number of different routes to that. And I think you know, it's also worth thinking about, though, it comes back to this issue around collaboration. How do we get on their agenda? Because, you know, sometimes members won't speak to you because they don't want to support your cause. It's difficult for them. It's not the party policy. So there may be a reason of not getting back in touch. But sometimes it's going to be about where are you on their priorities? How high profile a campaign do you have? And I think more and more, particularly in health issues, and maybe this is what you touched on as well, Sue, with your question, is collaboration is important. For example, you know, visual impairment, really hard to get an impact on the government's agenda. We started doing more collaboration, not just around, you know, with other visual impairment charities, but with sensory loss, working with RNID and National Deaf Children's Society to try and get an agenda that way. Now, often you want to do your own submission, your own thing as well. You know, we've all got our own specific concerns and issues. That happens, but at those moments to collaborate, particularly if, you know, in that crowded, you know, challenging area in terms of all the health priorities there are, you know, sometimes it is better to group together, and then people will are more, you know, more likely to pay attention to some of the policies you're bringing forward collectively, and that can have more impact, and you're more likely to get noticed.
Thank you very much, Richard. You've got 2 minutes to go, so that's taken me by surprise. That we've now got a bit of time. So Keith and Susan, have you got anything you'd like to add to that answer?
I really don't. I think Richard was brilliant there. That's along the lines I would have said too.
The only thing I'd add is, again, just supporting the collaboration aspect. We've managed to gather traction around our social security campaigning, but I think quite a lot of that has come from working in collaboration first. So we worked with the Scottish Commission on Rights to Social Security to get that credibility almost in terms of where we're at and what we're doing. So again, my predecessor Keith was very involved in getting involved with that and working with the Citizens Advice Scotland, just to raise our profile in that specific area of policy, whereas we were very much focused on health before. And because of that, we then, as Susan said, we've been invited to give evidence at Social Security Committee. We've been invited by other policy parts of government to be able to get involved in that, all based on the fact that we started off doing that collaboration stuff to raise our profile in that specific area of work. So I definitely think that's something that's worth pursuing, and collaboration is a big way forward for doing that and getting more credibility.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Tanith, I've seen your chat thing there. So I'm guessing the answer to that is don't be put off, just keep going, persist.
Yeah, really don't. You'll be waking up in the middle of the night going, oh my God, how did I let them get away with that? But it was too late.
Brilliant. Okay, let's move on. So question 4, this is for Susan. And the question is, how can charities be most influential with MSPs? And I think we've covered some of this already, but Susan, over to you.
Yeah, so I think there's parts here, from my view anyway, so it's influencing individual MSPs and then influencing a committee. They're different, and the ways that you'll go about it are different. In an individual MSP capacity, I think both Keith and Richard have said this already, and I think I briefly touched on it. It goes back to relationships. You have to get to know them, build a rapport, set initial meetings with MSPs, visit them in their constituencies if you have constituent business with them, nurture your relationships whenever you have something new in their area, or ask them to get involved in things. So then it's crucial to have that base. If you have that base, then if you need them for some reason, you have an established relationship and they're more likely to help you. Back when we were at Mary Curie, we had problems with one of our services, and it was the commissioning meant that we weren't able to kind of carry on the service. So we asked MSPs to intervene, and they did, and we got support that way, and we managed to keep the service. So it's kind of because we had good relationships with those MSPs, we could go to them and ask them to intervene on our behalf in that occasion, and they did, and it was a success. So it's things like that, and that takes time. You know, involving them in things that will make them look good, things that you know, things that they care about, making sure that they get to have a say on things that they care about. I should say MSPs love a photo opportunity. Sorry, Richard, I know you are a former MSP, but they do. They love a photo opportunity. If you can involve them in things that you're doing, then do that. You'll build up a really great relationship by giving them opportunities, which then will come back and they'll take a meeting with you, and they will listen to you on things that you really, really do want to speak to them about. So it's all a case of, as well as what Richard was saying earlier, about building a campaign as well, and having lots of conversations with them, things like that. Now, in a committee context, it's slightly different, and we've had a lot of engagement with people who come to us with requests for meetings. In a committee context, I would say make sure that you know what you're asking for, and this goes back to what Keith was saying earlier as well. Know what your ask is. We had someone come into the committee, and they had no ask. They came and we had a bit of a chat, talked about their organisation, but they didn't want anything from the committee. There was nothing that we could do. We asked them. So what I always say to people is, what's the one big thing that you want? What are you in this meeting? What's the one change that you want to see happen? And they didn't have an answer to that question. So, I mean, it was great. We went and we learned a little bit about their organisation, but they had nothing for us. There's nothing to take to the committee to say, you know, we want to see this action, we want to see this policy change, we want to question the government on this. There was none of that. There was nothing for us to do. So that was kind of almost like a wasted opportunity in a meeting. It kind of counteracts what I was saying a little bit about the relationships are key in the individual MSPs, but it's a different approach when you're approaching a committee. One thing about committee work is that you have to understand the party politics that's going on, the dynamics of the committee. You have to understand what the makeup of the committee is, whether it's an SFP-led committee, whether it's an opposition-led committee. When we were doing the work on social security, we had to get cross-party support from the members of the committee when we were looking to get those amendments at stage 2. We had to make sure we got the right MSP to lodge the amendment. We had to make sure that there was enough support from the other MSPs in the room. We also did a lot of work with Scottish Government to let them know the position as well. So that was one of the ways that we also drew upon, obviously, the individual relationships that we had as well from the individual MSPs. but it was knowing the party politics of it, knowing who you need to approach, because that is essential. How do we approach a different MSP as the lead? Splitting the amendment might not have had the same effect. So it's really thinking about how the committee is made up. And what I should say is, like, make sure you've lobbied Scottish Government on those things as well. Make sure that they know what you're asking for, because they might actually make those changes themselves. And so sometimes it's not always necessarily going straight to the MSP. Sometimes you want to make sure the Scottish Government are well aware of what you're doing. So it's something in tandem that you want to do. And one of those that we saw recently in the Transvaginal Mesh Bill, Jackie Bailey submitted an amendment that everybody agreed with, and it went through at stage 2, and the government agreed with Jackie. So it was kind of, you want to make sure, and Jackie will have been briefed around, around that amendment. So it's getting into that right person, but also getting government on side as well, so they're not blindsided by something. Richard and Keith, I'm aware you have a lot of experience in these areas as well. So is there anything you would like to add at this point?
I'll add one thing. I think that MSP's teams are quite small and are covering an awful lot of different policy areas. So I think one of the strengths that we have in terms of some of the relationships we have around social security is we can do some of the heavy lifting. And I know we're lucky in that we're an organisation that has 2 members of staff working in policy and public affairs. So we can do some of that heavy lifting. And because we've built that relationship, they trust what information we take to them and how we can position with them. So it takes some of the weight off them. So it's that mutually beneficial aspect to that relationship, which I think helps take it that little bit further forward. So try and do some of that for MSPs. You want to try and build that relationship to take it forward.
Thank you very much. We have got 3 questions left, and then we're going to go to open floor, just to get an understanding of how many people would like to ask questions in the open floor session, whether we go ahead with the other 3 questions that are already set, or we have sufficient questions from the audience now. Can you raise a hand if you think you've got something you'd like to ask the panelists at this point? And if not so many hands are raised, I think we can just keep going. Okay, just one hand from Mary. So I think from now we'll just keep going with the preset questions, because I think it's really interesting to cover these questions here. Okay, so question 5. This is directed towards Keith. And again, it feels now that we've covered this in part. However, if you only had time and capacity to influence just one body, which would you invest in and why? And that's Parliament, government and local bodies such as health boards, health and social care partnerships or councils.
Thanks, Alice. As you see, I think we've covered this in detail to some extent earlier on in the discussion and conversations we've had. And again, it goes back down to priorities. What is the priority for your specific organisation? What is it that you want to change? If it's something that's controlled by a health board, spending your time focusing on the health board is definitely the way to go. But it's also a more common situation than you might think. So although I've just said about the fact that we've got a relatively big team at the Society compared to some of the smaller organisations, and we've got people in London doing similar jobs, we're still in that same position. There are 14 territorial health boards, there's 32 local authorities, and there's 31 health and social care partnerships. So you have to be very targeted in what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. So again, it comes back to that: what is your objective and what do you want to achieve? I think organisations such as the Neurological Alliance have a key role to play in that and bringing that collaboration forward, so that if there is something that you do feel strongly about but you don't have the capacity to focus in on that, using the Neurological Alliance to be able to do some of that work for you is definitely a way forward. There's lots of organisations around the table today who will have similar positions and policy positions. We might not all have the time and capacity to be able to take that forward, but as an alliance we should be able to do that work. And I think in terms of the policy group going forward, that's probably one of the things that we could do better with, that is take some of those policy issues and actually act and take advantage of when a specific organisation has some downtime, and be able to target that and use some of that in terms of how we engage nationally and how we influence nationally. I'll talk a little bit about 3 campaigns just to highlight how it's probably very nuanced in terms of what situation you're in. Now, the 3 campaigns are looking at local MS services, and the ultimate goal of the campaign was looking at making the MS nurses caseload more manageable. Now, for each I was involved directly in 2 of them, and one of them I wasn't involved in. Our ultimate goal in all 3 was to increase the number of MS nurses there were in that position. That was the ideal, the gold standard. However, we were aware that we might not achieve that. So we had graded opportunities and graded objectives to say, how can we actually manage this situation to make the caseload more manageable? So one of those examples was in the borders, NHS borders. So the MS nurse there didn't have any administrative support, didn't have any access to a multidisciplinary team. So those two key factors could take some of the weight in terms of the actual caseload for NHS borders. We knew they didn't have the funding to actually employ another nurse. Didn't mean we didn't still ask for that, but it meant that we could go and actually negotiate and have discussions around how we could do that better. But one of the key things we had to actually look at was we didn't want to upset the MS nurse and make it feel as if it's critical. We didn't want to upset NHS borders. So it was very much done in collaboration with NHS borders. So it was very much a health board campaign, and we worked with the clinicians and the management team at the health board. So it was very much focused in on that. Similar situation up in Elgin in terms of them. And the nurse there is employed by the Health and Social Care Partnership, the MS nurse, as opposed to being directly employed by the health board, although it was NHS Grampian that was the health board. So again, we had to take a slightly different approach to that, and we actually had to engage and work with the Health and Social Care Partnership because they were directly involved in supporting the MS nurse and they managed the MS nurse. But also in terms of the additional support we could provide, or we would like to provide to the MS nurse to take some of that caseload off, it was community physiotherapists. It was looking at a rehab consultant visiting that area. It was trying to get the neurologist to actually set up a clinic in Elgin rather than it being somewhere else. So again, we targeted the health board in terms of trying to get the increased neurology capacity within Elgin, but we also then had to target and focus in on how we influenced around the Health and Social Care Partnership, the different aspects of that. So looking at the community physio teams, looking at the support from others, so we could try and take that a different way. So a very similar situation, slightly different goals and how we could achieve it and what we could do, and a different way of influencing around that. The last one, which is the one I wasn't directly involved in, was around NHS Lanarkshire, and it came to a head quite quickly because they were very understaffed in terms of their MS nurse provision per how many people with MS there was in the area. However, it was made worse by the fact that the MS nurse left at the time. So there was no MS nurse cover. Again, similarity with Murray, that we targeted the Health Board and the Health and Social Care Partnership because they both had cards in the game, so to speak, in terms of how we could do that. But we also then started to lobby at a national level around that, because the Scottish Government don't want one of the health boards to be lagging behind everywhere else and not have that aspect. We had local MSPs who were interested in that campaign. So we brought in other aspects of that to put pressure on from a different angle. Again, I think Susan mentioned earlier on that you can use different ways into actually put pressure on to fix that situation. I don't know if anybody from the MS Trust is here. I know they were on the invite list and they were possibly coming along. But again, they got involved in that campaign as well. So it wasn't just the MS Society, it wasn't just the MS community, it was a multi-collaborative approach from all the different organisations to try and put pressure and change. And again, we're quite lucky in that situation that the MS Trust were bringing funding to the table. So again, it made it easier for Scottish Government to sit around that table and actually try and push things forward. And again, I think at the time, it was a very similar time to when Gordon Aikman was doing his campaign around the MND nurses. So some of the funding that was made available for specialist nursing at that point was actually able to be directed towards the MS service, and it was very, very much used. So I think you can see from that although it's a very similar situation, what our objectives were ultimately were to reduce the caseload for the MS nurses, but we used different approaches to try and achieve it and trying to manage it depending on the specific situation in that area. And to do that, we used and pulled on different levers. So it's not necessarily straightforward, but I think in terms of focusing on what your priorities are, but also use others and work in collaboration as much as you can to influence at the other levels, which you might not have the time and capacity to do. So I'm not sure if Susan or Richard want to come in and add anything to that.
No. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Keith. That was fantastic. The next question is a very specific question. And this is open to all of you, and this is from someone in the room today. And so please all three of you chip in if you can help with this one. And the question is, the NHS is motivated by targets and the budgets which accompany them. Can third sector organisations suggest or influence target setting? And if so, how? Susan, you've unmuted first, so I'm going to pounce on you.
I mean, this is a really, really tough one, to be honest. And I think what I should say is it's very context specific. It depends on the target. What I would say is, if it's something that's been set by Scottish Government, then you can lobby them to change it. If it's something that's set by local NHS boards, that could be harder. As ways of influencing, there are other scrutiny bodies such as Healthcare Improvement Scotland that may be able to help with that. There's things like patient representative forums on NHS boards. That's really the end of my knowledge, I'm afraid. I think it really is very context specific, and it's whether you need to go at government level or whether you need to go at the NHS board level. I would say good luck with the NHS board level. I don't think I've been successful in changing things like that in the past. It will take a lot of work, I think. I don't know if anyone else has more insights in that. Sorry, that's a bit of a hokey answer.
Yep, thank you, Susan. Richard, over to you.
And the health board level is really difficult. I know that health boards do regular contact with local MSPs, and obviously, you know, the directions for NHS Scotland are really important to them. So again, it may well be, as Susan was saying, going at a national level, and also, you know, looking at what partnerships are delivering those health services. So I mean, although I'm just in the door at Enable, one thing they've been really effective at is working with the Scottish Government and COSLA to identify that issue of people, particularly learning disabled people, who should be in their communities, who should have their own accommodation supported by their own care teams, who are in vastly inappropriate care settings in older people's homes, in long-term hospital care. And what they've done is they've worked to get a policy agreement through their and the coming home policy with the Scottish Government and COSLA to set a target in 2 years. They're going to make very substantive progress in terms of returning, making sure that each of those individuals is an appropriate care setting for their needs. And so I think it does actually take not only those local dialogue with health boards, but often with national the national statutory bodies as well.
Thank you, Keith.
Again, it's not something that I've had huge experience of, and I'd say I appreciate the difficulty, and my experience generally has been around setting the neurological standards and looking at the neurological framework, and obviously they work through a consultation process with that, but also in terms of how that's implemented and how that's been recorded, we've sort of taken a bottom-up approach from that. And so we'll start to work with clinicians, and it's trying to look at a cross-Scotland multidisciplinary approach from clinicians to try and get them to buy in to see what it is we need to put in place to actually measure the standards effectively and use that as a tool to measure performance, and almost then dictate what those targets could be or should be, or how the money's then spent. So we've been quite lucky in that, and we have supportive neurologists who are willing to work with us in terms of taking that forward. But it's very much been a bottom-up approach, and again, we're very lucky that we sit on the steering group for the Scottish MS Register, which is a Public Health Scotland organising part of the Public Health Scotland, who measure the standards and actually take feedback from each health board in terms of where they're at with that. So working with the register lead, we've managed to be able to record and change what they're recording in terms of how they're performing against that. And we'll use that as a baseline. So it's been very much a bottom-up approach, and it'll probably be a long-term piece of work to try and get to the point where we can see what we do with that. But that's the approach that we think is going to pay the most dividends in terms of changing how that works. And we can then use that information from Public Health Scotland to put more pressure on the health boards to influence directly what they're doing.
Thank you. Stu, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Alice. I'm just wondering who could possibly have asked this question. Just in response to that, well, firstly, thank you very much, and I've been busy scribbling notes, and I appreciate that. My question was drafted, and I maybe should have made this clear, that the situation at the moment is not that we want to influence an existing goal or target or budget, but there isn't one that exists, and so we're seeking the creation of a target ab initio. And I like very much the response from was it Keith? I think it was yourself, Keith, that said that what do clinicians want? That's something I'd never thought of before, so I appreciate that. That's very good. Would your responses be changed at all if you had known, and I had said in my question, this isn't a start from scratch thing rather than changing something existing?
think I'll just respond very, very, very briefly to that. Again, it might have changed slightly. I think there's a lot of targets that already exist, and I think there would probably have to be a conversation with whoever it was, whether it was with Scottish Government or whether it was with kind of NHS about setting that target, because I know that there is a reticence to have more and more targets, and quite a lot of them are more focused towards outcome-based pushes rather than the targets themselves, because we know a lot of the targets aren't met. In fact, probably most targets aren't met, so I think there is a reticence to add more and more to that added target kind of set. Yeah, I think it would need a conversation with who you're trying to do that with. I think what Keith was saying about change from the bottom, so speaking with clinicians is a really, really good way of doing that. I think that's a brilliant bit of advice.
Thank you very much, Susan. I kind of wonder if maybe one approach based on what you're responding is that, and based also on what everyone has said earlier, is trying to find out what your adversaries' goals are, what their objectives are, is to try and find a way of, well, if we give you this new target, could you take an old one down? Maybe that's a way to approach it. I don't know. That needs some brainstorming.
Absolutely, there's stuff that you know, you're saying that this isn't working. This isn't doing what it should be doing. We think this would be better, and we have an evidence base to show that this would be a better way to look at the issues. Then I think that's a really good way of doing things as well. This target, terrible. This is actually a better way and will help you collect better data or better outcomes or whatever it is. I think that's quite a good tool to have as well.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say as well, Stu, that yes and no would be my answer to your question about would I change my answer. So there would be elements that I would have changed, but I think the body of it would still be that bottom-up approach. And I think there's a potential then to gather as much evidence you can from people living with ME to see what their experience is, and gathering that alongside the clinician's experience of it and showing what the fact that there's nothing there that actually helps set the targets and drives the standard of care for people living with ME, and doing it that way. So again, it's a very bottom-up approach, and it's probably a long process, but starting from that point of gathering as much evidence as you can, take it forward, and then going to a friendly MSP or whatever, try and have some of those conversations around that, or NHS Scotland to start that conversation off. And if it's, and again, Health Improvement Scotland's probably another place to go to have some of those conversations around that.
That's extremely helpful. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. I hope it's helped others too.
Thank you, Stu. That's great. Mary, your hand's up. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to give you 1 minute to put your question to the panel.
How could we encourage more neurologists to come to Scotland to work? Because I was at a hospital in Dundee, my neurologist left. I had to travel from Inverness to Newcastle to continue my treatment. So we need a lot more neurologists encouraged to come and live it and work in Scotland. And it would help all neurological conditions.
I think that's a very good point. Very well raised. Panelists, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I was just going to say, I agree, and there's been situations where people living with MS have been left in similar situations without there. We do have some levers we can pull on around the neurological framework in terms of the workforce planning of that. Again, how realistic it is to be able to use those levers is difficult, but I think it's probably something that we, as a Neurological Alliance, will probably stand more chance of actually influencing changing that than we would have as individual organisations. But I think it's definitely something that's on the MS Society's agenda going forward, and I'm sure it is amongst others. I can see others nodding around the room, so yeah, I'd agree with that as well, Mary.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mary. We've got a few. I'm really mindful that I want to make sure we finish on time as chair. So 8 minutes left. We've got one question left, which is actually, I think, one of the most interesting questions as well. And we've then got a final poll we're going to put to you to see how you have found, whether you found today's session useful or not. So let's just race on. Richard, this one is directed towards you. And the question is, charities spend a lot of time on different approaches to engage with key stakeholders and influence outcomes. What is the least effective approach that you've seen that you would not recommend?
So I could actually be quite brief in this answer, because I'll just go straight to those horrific chain emails you used to get. I don't know if they still do them, but you'd like, oh, they do. Oh, it's awful. I mean, because you'd like get 3 or 4, 300 emails or more than that to your office on one issue, and somebody just puts in their email address, and then it's a standard text. So everyone's sending you exactly the same message. So nothing new. They might change 1 or 2 words. And your constituency office has to go through all these and get a reply to each one and make sure there isn't something you've missed in case someone sends you an angry reply. You haven't addressed the one slight, difference in terms of the email. It drives everybody wild. And actually, I was on a recent, discussion like this, and Kes Dugdale was saying that she had exactly the same approach as thought. So I don't know if like change.org and organizers still do that sort of thing. If any, even I'm sure I know it's great campaigners here. I can see from the people here that you wouldn't do that, but I mean, it used to happen a lot, and I think it lost a lot of goodwill for some really important issues, because it doesn't feel like you're really putting any energy into it. If all you're doing is I mean, I know people put releases out, or we had umpteen thousand people respond to that, but all you've done is really irritated people with all these emails. And I meant you couldn't do other work in the office because you had to respond to all these standard emails. And it doesn't feel like you put any energy into the campaign. All you've done is press send, and it feels like the people who designed the campaign just set out to irritate you more than anything else. So I would definitely stay away from that kind of thing. Make sure it's tailored. It's from the people who the campaign affects, and it's that personal touch is so important. So those kind of chain and anonymous campaigns are, well, in my humble opinion, not good.
Oh, I can see we've got the panelists are both raising their hands, but Keith, yours went first. Tanith, your hand's up as well. I think Keith, let's get Keith in first to answer, to contribute, and then we'll come back to Tanith for your second question.
I'd agree. Richard Thomas, who's my colleague, worked in the MSP's office, and that was what he said, and we sort of had a quick look over the questions together. So yeah, I'd agree. The other approach, and say I've touched on it earlier, is that I've seen hasn't worked well, is looking at that aggressive confrontational approach, and using a big stick to beat people with. Our organisation published a report a few years ago about how many people are on DMTs, and it was a self-reported questionnaire. We didn't necessarily speak to the clinicians and consultants beforehand, and their data differed from ours, and all it did was actually we managed to put an awful lot of backs up and damage some of those relationships we've spent an awful long time looking at, because we took that confrontational approach. And again, I think that's one of the things I touched on earlier, is try and understand where the person that you're having the conversation with is coming from, because you might not agree, but if you can at least see where their point of view is, you can go around that in a different way and actually try and use the conversation slightly differently.
Thank you very much. Tanith,
I've got a question, which is, seriously, it's like music to my ears about the pointlessness of e-campaigning, which I've always kind of thought. The issue is, I think that for a lot of organizations, we come under a huge amount of pressure to do this because it's one of the metrics that our board wants to look at. It's to do with, it's a measure of how involved people are in what we're doing. If it was your organization, what would you be telling those decision makers to say, no, really, this doesn't work, which isn't just, I went to a meeting and an ex-MSP said this is the least useful thing you can do, which I will be feeding back.
Susan, do you want to take that, or is that why you raised your hand?
Yeah, kind of partly to say I completely wholeheartedly agree with Richard. I have always hated those campaigns, even doing them. So I have done campaigns like that. And we've done that, and we've had success as well doing those campaigns, but as a part of a coordinated approach. Now, I would never do one again, because I think that it just, sorry for the language here, just pisses people off. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. What I would say is instead of investing in some kind of software that will do that, and instead of investing in training people to be able to figure all that out, because I remember I had to build those campaigns in the background, and it was horrendous. It was a lot of work, really hard. Don't invest in any of that. Invest in people who can build those relationships. That is a much better use of money and time. But the one thing I just wanted to pick up on was that, you know, those one size fits all approaches, it never works. One size does not fit all. Personalize, personalize, personalize is the way to go. You want to speak to someone and you don't want them to be thinking that you've had that exact conversation or exact email to somebody else. You know, everyone is different. You want to tailor your communications to them. You want to use any personal information or ins that you have, any relationship that you have. It never send the same thing. Particularly don't send the same thing to Scottish Government as you're sending to Scottish Parliament, because they're very different and the way that they will respond to things is different as well. But yeah, just to highlight that. Anyway, I'm done.
Thank you. And actually, just before we go on to the final poll, Ewan from the ME Association raised a very good point just in answer to not making a nuisance of yourself. And his point is when the end result can be people dying or deteriorating as a result of being ignored, maybe being a nuisance is the only proportionate response. And I think that's quite a valid point. So I just wanted to share that with everyone today. So I'm just going to move on. Thank you very much to everyone, to the panelists, especially for your brilliant insights. I'm just going to close after. We're going to do a final poll. And then with your permission, if you're happy for me to, I'd like to do a screenshot that I can put onto a Twitter post just to say we've had the meeting today and to have all of your happy faces put out onto the internet. But I'm just going to do this poll first, if I can. Maybe I can't help. How do there we go, end of event poll, there's the one. Here you go. So the question is, do you now feel more confident to take part in engagement activities in Scotland as a result of having had this session? So this will show the panelists how brilliant you have been, or how people have perceived it. So I think there's 22 people in the room, including the panelists. So I think that 17, 18, 19, 21, 22. Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share it. Unanimously, everyone has had a very has really enjoyed it today. So thank you very, very much to the panelists. I'm just going to close that, and can I just are you all happy for me to do a screenshot? Can you all nod? Right, control, print screen, done. That's brilliant. It's 1:30. I'm really, really happy. Thank you so much to everyone. Richard, Susan and Keith, you've been fantastic panelists. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it. We'll send around a feedback form to everyone afterwards so you can let us know in more detail if you've got other feedback. And also just let us know if you have ideas or suggestions for future knowledge sharing events. I think this format works really well. A panel is a really lovely way of doing it. So let me know as well. Thank you, everyone.
Well done, Alice.
Thank you.
Oh, seriously, I thought that went